All set? Okay, so we've said that the classical style is a balance or even a harmony, as we're going to find out, between, in the concerto, the orchestra and the soloist, generally speaking, between convention, that which everybody uses, like those basic chords, which are about as basic as it gets in the piano concerto number 20, the second movement, and invention, something that's very individual. The only time that melody is used is in this particular piece. This harmony is used in literally millions of songs. Okay? So that, and there you've got the harmony. You've got the two things happening at once. The very individual melody and the very generic harmony. And that is the essence of classical style. And that, said the classicists, I'll say it one more time, was taken from the model of nature, in which the tree is a generic thing. There are millions of them, and we all know what it is. And yet that tree, right through that window there, is one tree alone, and no other tree is that tree. And how is it possible that something can be so individual and so generic at the same time? The same thing is true of us, of course. Something about us is human, and that's true of every one of us that's on the face of the globe. And yet there's no one on the face of the globe that is the same as you are, or that you are, or I am. Right? So that mysterious balance between the extremely individual and the extremely generic, again, in music, in nature, is classical. So, from here, let's go to the broader organization of this piece, the second movement, because it's one of the most common, most popular, and most meaningful, perhaps, resonating compositional forms of the classical age. It's used again later on in Romantic era, but with a different accent, so to speak. We'll get to that then when we get to that. So let's begin the piece again, and I'll have Lourdes scroll through this organizational chart which I made for you. This is on the content area of the blackboard, so you can pull this off, print it out. And it starts with the melody. I don't have the whole thing, obviously, it gets too complicated, but notice the basic melody is here. And I put a little arch over that to show you the first half of the first half. That becomes the first half. That's the piano introduction, the first theme. The first theme is made up of what's called an antecedent. These are horrible words. They were invented much later than Mozart. Mozart never used words like this. They were invented by the Romantic era to try to describe what they were doing back then. Mozart just did it instinctively, as did Haydn. But the first half of a half is called an antecedent. The second half of a half, which concludes it or feels like it brings it to something like a stasis of some sort, is called the consequent. So this phrase that the piano plays has an antecedent and a consequent together, which make an antecedent for the consequent, which consists of an antecedent and a consequent, and that whole schmear, technical term by the way, schmear, is an antecedent for the consequent that the orchestra is then going to pick up here, where the orchestra plays the same thing, and it feels like the orchestra is concluding with its 8 measures of antecedent, consequent, this antecedent. Does that make sense? Okay. In other words, it's one arch above another arch. It looks like one of those really complex Roman aqueducts or something. Never mind. So let's play that again, and I'll just have you come through that. So from the beginning, and now we're going to walk through what's called the sonata allegro form and show you how over a broader structure, this whole movement is a balance between convention, or something that's more defined and a little bit more structured, and something that's more free, because that too is the human balance between things that we are defined by things that are defined for us, our roles as men, women, fathers, mothers, children, etc. Society defines part of our lives. And part of our lives we are free to invent ourselves. We can't overcome our human nature, that's defined for us. But we can decide whether we want to be an architect or a English teacher in high school. That is something that we can decide. So between this definition and this freedom is the human nature, and music kind of reflects that as also in the relationship between the three parts of the sonata allegro form. I'll take you through that. The first part is called the exposition. In the exposition, we see the themes. The piano has just introduced our first theme. I'll shout them out as they come along. There's going to be a second theme that the piano also introduces. Here we go. So. Second half of the first theme. That whole thing becomes the antecedent for the orchestra. It's the same thing, but it feels like the conclusion of what the piano's just said. Now the piano picks it up again, scroll down just a little bit, to a variation. It feels like a new melody, but actually the second half of it is the same as the second half of the first melody, so it's just a variation. With that little change, the orchestra says the same thing. A new first half, same second half. And the orchestra says, okay, that's a good idea, I'll do that too. With a slight ending here at the end. Transition. A little bit farther down. Notice you can go down a little bit here. Down to here. To the bridge. And then we're going to go back up again. Oh, I'm sorry, no, not yet. Second theme. A new melody. Complex. Not very. Notice what the orchestra is doing. It's not waiting its turn anymore. It's playing the accompaniment. Now the orchestra is supporting the piano. The two parts have become harmony. Not a balance anymore, but a harmony. So it's like, the piano has a little more to say, it gets a little more complex. This is all still part of the second theme, much more complicated, but still relatively simple, relatively elegant. Back to the first theme. Not because you haven't heard it before and don't know how it goes, but because it makes the thing feel more balanced. More complicated middle section, come back to a predefined melody. And guess what comes next? Now you're expecting this. You've heard the orchestra do this before, so you know what's going to happen, in that sense of fulfilling your expectations that are already there is also part of the classical style. Before you didn't know it was going to happen, now you do. Now, this is the development section. You can go up to here. Now let me just explain what the development section is. This is, again, the sonata allegro form. Let me put that on the board for you. Allegro means fast. It's, the same form was used actually sometimes in slower movements as well. This is not all that fast, actually. They're relatively slow, except for here. There are three sections. I should have made that maybe not on its head there. The first one we heard was called the exposition. Again, exposition. These words, again, were invented after the classical age, not during the classical age. And what we've just come to now is the second stage, which is the development. The exposition basically introduces us to the themes. There were two of them. We had the first one, then the second one, which is more complex, and then we came back to the first one. Now, the development section, what the development section does is it takes off the training wheels. Training wheels is not the right word. It takes off the guideposts. In other words, all of a sudden the piece seems to lash out, loosen up, become totally free. And you can feel that in a lot of ways. So it takes various things from the themes, the musical themes, and just mixes them up. It's very much like the late Baroque style in some ways. And what you hear here, for example, in this piece, there are no phrases anymore. It doesn't feel like you've got an antecedent and a consequent. Those have all suddenly dissolved. They've disappeared. And all you get is diddle, 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 all through the whole thing, until the very end of the development where the diddle, diddle, diddle becomes da 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 da, and the da 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 turns into da 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 da, and the da 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 turns into dum 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 dim dum dum dum. Dee, da, 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 dee, and then we go back to as if it were to the beginning, and that's the next section. So, in other words, the development section is totally free. The composer becomes free, and sometimes the soloist becomes free. Not so much in this case, but we'll talk about that again when we get to that. And so, when we get back to the beginning again, that it repeats the themes from the exposition. And that's called a recapitulation. Recapitulation. Which is basically that. It recaps what you've heard before. Again, not because you don't know it, but because it makes it feel whole. It makes it feel like it's closed, and it gives the convention. It takes this freedom and contains it within the convention of the first and the last section, which you already have heard. There's one little gimmick here at the end which makes this feel a little different than the exposition. I'll come to that in a moment, or two gimmicks actually. So we come to the development section again. The orchestra and the piano are playing totally intertwined, and it's like in that late Baroque style where the piano hands off to the orchestra, the orchestra hands off to the piano, and sometimes the oboes are like crying in the background, as if they don't. And those are all detached from this structure that we had before, from these 4-bar phrases, and you'll see that there's no way of counting 4 plus 4 anymore. I'm going to come back to that again. So what the classical age says, if we have too much structure, too much convention, it feels closed, it feels boring. We need a place where it lets loose, but that letting loose, that freedom has to be contained within law. Thy liberty in law, right? Like from our, yeah.
So the piece as a whole is the sonata, and then
Sorry?
the piece as a whole is
the whole
form.
schmear, the whole movement is a sonata. Okay. So the sonata is exposition plus development plus recapitulation.
Okay.
Sometimes this exposition is repeated, and even in this movement, I believe sometimes it's repeated. This soloist doesn't do this, or this director actually makes those decisions. But you're right, those 3 parts together. There's a little button at the end, so to speak, sometimes called the coda, which is also here. But we'll get to that in a moment. So back to the development stage. I'm going to go back here, show you once again where the exposition ends, so that we can hear the distinction. Let's see if I can hit that right. Of course not. Orchestra is picking up right here, number 8. Now elegance just suddenly explodes. Right here. Boom! The piano is not the most important instrument here. The oboes are. Right? And they pass that back and forth between the piano and the orchestra. And this diddle-a-diddle-a-diddle-a-diddle-a-diddle has not stopped for a single moment through this entire middle section. Notice how the piano and the oboes go back and forth. Now this rhythm is going to start slowing down after the climax, but the climax is pretty powerful. And we're coming to the climax, and 3 now octaves in the piano. The rhythm has changed. A little slower. It's changed again, a little slower. And that's going to change again. Dum, 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 dum. Little turn. And we're in the recapitulation. And now you recognize that voice. And after all that turmoil, after all that freedom, which was almost unbearable at the end, we get that elegant return to form and expectation, convention. Orchestra picks that up. I'm sorry, not yet. The piano goes right to the second theme. Like a conclusion. You haven't heard this before. Notice that the strings are accompanying the piano again. It. So everybody goes back to their places, so to speak, where the strings accompany the piano. The piano sometimes accompanies the orchestra, but the relationships between the generic and the individual are reestablished at the end, and it feels like it's rounded off the whole. Right? Does that make sense? So without that middle section, that piece would be a little boring. But with the middle section, the slow part at the beginning and the end feel like they have have a more elegant place, right? And it's like they are containing this energy that's in the middle, this sort of restless, almost demonic energy, diddle, 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 diddle. There's something almost hysterical about that, you know, considering how gentle and elegant the beginning and the ending are. And that combination of freeing up the reins for something as powerful as that middle section, and putting the reins back on for something as genteel, you might say, as the recapitulation, is the classical style. So form which contains invention, convention which contains invention. Make sense? That's the sonata allegro form. That ending, that little new material at the end is called the coda. There we go. Coda. And that's just like a little conclusion after. If it just ended with the beginning, like the exposition, finished the exposition and ended, it would feel a little bit canned, right, that ending. So you want to say something, just like you do in a paper. You finish, you've done your introduction, you've established your argument, and instead of just saying, okay, well, you know, there it is, you know, I proved it, you say something at the end like, and if only we could do this in our lives, yeah, I don't know, whatever the conclusion is, right? So that there's a kind of generic feeling to the ending that draws a more general conclusion from the material. That's it. Okay, thanks.